Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'm a Sony Global Imaging Ambassador, and I'd like to talk to you about the metering systems inside the Sony Alpha cameras. Now, the metering systems is the way that the cameras determine the most appropriate exposure and ensures that we don't get images that are too dark or too light. Occasionally these systems do make mistakes, so occasionally we want to alter some of these settings. So this is where we're going to learn the way that we can control the cameras for the most reliable exposures. Now, the default metering system inside of all of the Sony cameras is a metering system called Multi, and it is by far and away the most reliable way of getting consistently good exposures from our camera. But it's not magic. It doesn't really understand what we're taking pictures of, so occasionally it can make errors, and this is where we come in and override some of the automated settings so that we can get the best exposure or the most appropriate exposure for the image that we're trying to create. Now, what I'm trying to do here is I've just blurred that image massively, so you can see that most of the images that we actually capture have an average medium tone when we mix up all of the dark shades and the light shades, and this is essentially what the metering systems are always trying to do. They expect most scenes to be of average tone when the light and dark tones are mixed up. And so they get it right most of the time. Now, some scenes are not average, however. In this scene we can quite clearly see the amount of white marble in this building here is going to not be an average mid-tone scene. So what we are able to do is we're able to use exposure compensation. Now, there is a dedicated dial on the full frame mirrorless cameras, and you can use exposure compensation on the crop sensor bodies as well. And the dial, of course, is a dedicated dial on the top of the camera. So in instances where we feel that the exposure needs modifying, making darker or lighter, we can just simply use the exposure compensation dial. We don't need to alter the metering system. So in the previous image that you saw here, I'm simply raising the exposure. Otherwise, the image would appear quite grey rather than quite bright, and this is a sort of thing that you might find if you're photographing images in the snow, which are predominantly bright tone subjects, and so we tend to just roll the exposure dial to a plus setting in these instances. Now remember, the EVF in the monitor on the Sony cameras in the default mode is showing you what the sensor will capture. It's a what you see is what you get view, and so if the viewfinder appears too dark, then just check whether you're underexposing the image, and I'll show you how you can check that in great detail further on in the movie. Okay, so exposure compensation dial is definitely your friend. Now, this is the only full frame mirrorless camera that actually features a dedicated exposure compensation dial at the moment when I'm making this movie. Now, in the opposite scenario, you see, we have an image that is predominantly dark toned, and if you don't make an exposure compensation when you're using the multi-metering system, this black gorilla will appear to be a grey gorilla, and so generally we just wind the compensation back. Now, I've listed this as -1, but in some instances it might be as much as -2. You just, again, you can be guided by the live histogram in the viewfinder or on the back of the camera, or just how the viewfinder itself appears. Let's dive into the metering systems and see alternatives to the multi-system. So if you press the FN key on the back of the Sony camera, you should see in the function menus there, you should see a metering mode feature. Now, you may have removed this, but it is there by default. If it's not there in your function menu, you're going to have to dive into the menus itself by pressing the menu button. Okay, once you've located and you've navigated to that metering mode, just press the center button in the control wheel to enter and look at your options. Now, as I said, multi is the default. Now the camera is actually pointed at a white piece of paper, and you can see that if left to its own devices, it'll render that white piece of paper grey. Remember, this is what always the metering systems are always trying to do. They're trying to give you an average tone, and you have to tell the camera occasionally, this is not an average subject, so I'm going to make a modification. Now, in this instance, we have a very bright wall behind a fair-skinned young woman, and again, the camera will indicate down here that we're actually getting an exposure which is correct. Okay, if it's under or over, you'll get a minus or a plus figure there. But again, it doesn't know that the dominant tones in this image are light tones. You can see from the histogram that I've got visible in the EVF that the peak of tones is in the center. Basically, the metering system is trying to register most of the tones middle tone or mid-toned inside this image. Now, we can make some modifications to how the multi-metering system works, and one of these you'll find inside of the menus here. On the third generation of cameras, we have the option to do face priority in multimeter. Now what this does is if it detects a face, it's going to, and you're using the multi-metering system, it's going to try and render those skin tones more accurately, irregardless of whether there's very bright tones or very dark tones either side of the face that you're photographing. So this is a way of giving compensation of exposure towards a selected area within the frame. And so this can help educate the multi-system to make more appropriate exposures. So if I go into that menu system here, I can switch that to on. Now it may help in some instances, but again, you may find that you want to go and use the exposure compensation dial and try and modify that until you get a more accurate or pleasing rendition of the tones. And again, you can be guided by the histogram in the viewfinder. Now you can cycle using the display button on the back of the camera to see what views you can have presented to you on the monitor and the viewfinder. And by far and away, my most useful view is the one with the histogram in the viewfinder. So if you've taken the image and you want to review the image, here I've pressed the review button on the back of the camera. If you hit the display a couple of times, you'll come through to the histogram. Okay, now you get all of the metadata that you've used, or the camera settings you've used to take the image, and you'll also get a breakdown of the RGB channels and also the luminance channel, which is the one on the top. Now if you've overexposed the image, the highlights will blink at you. Now this is a JPEG preview, even if you're shooting raw images. So in some instances, if you get the highlights blinking at you, they can be recovered slightly if you're shooting in the raw file format. If you want to get a more faithful or accurate histogram inside of your cameras, you can go into the creative style settings in your camera and just lower the contrast by -1 or -2. And here in fact is showing you I've used an exposure compensation to force the camera to overexpose, and now what is happening is basically we're blinking. Those areas of black are showing overexposure, and you can also see in the histogram here the histogram is climbing up the right side of the wall showing overexposure. Okay, now I've got a little movie that I can play to show the blinking here, because I've recorded the EVF, and there it is blinking with a +2 exposure. I've dropped to a +1, less overexposure, and just the standard exposure, very minimal amount of blinking. Now don't worry too much if you find a light source or a little bit of blinking of highly reflective surfaces such as chrome. It is okay to overexpose what we call the specular highlights. Things that are reflecting the light source would be expected to be overexposed. Now remember, if you are going to review images after you've captured them, Just remember, it doesn't really matter how dark the midtones and shadows are appearing in the viewfinder, especially for RAW shooters, because we're going to control the darkness or brightness of those shadows in post-processing. If you're a JPEG shooter, then you can use Dynamic Range Optimizer in the camera settings to lighten the shadows. Now, this will have no effect on the RAW files. We need to process those manually. So the important thing to take away from this is gauge the exposure, the appropriate exposure on the brightest highlights. It's okay to keep pushing the highlights brighter and brighter until they start blinking, and that is the most appropriate exposure in landscape photography. The brightest exposure where the highlights are not overexposed. And then we can simply use the shadow slider in a program such as Lightroom to lighten those shadows. So expose for the highlights and process for the shadows. Again, to give you some more examples in using multi-metering, here if I point at a very frosty scene in the UK in the middle of winter, the camera, left to its own devices, is going to render this as a very grey, dismal scene. So again, you can be guided by the histogram, but you can push this exposure maybe 1 or 2 stops brighter. And again, just use the exposure compensation dial. I've been using this exposure compensation dial for so long now, I find myself adjusting it without me even thinking about adjusting. It's something that is very conveniently placed for the thumb, and so I'll just roll that up or down to style the image that I'm working with. You don't have to be critical about this if you're a RAW shooter. You can fine-tune that exposure in post-processing. The most important thing, however, is not to overexpose those highlights. They cannot be recovered if the overexposure is too severe. I've pushed the exposure compensation dial, and then I render a frosty scene, bright and crisp, and just the way that I want to present it. And then I might fine-tune it a little bit more in my post-processing software. And again, be guided by the histogram. Okay, just hit the review button, hit the display button a couple of times to go in and start reviewing the image, so you can look at the histograms and you can look for what I call the blinkies. Okay, so eventually you'll start understanding what images would underexpose and overexpose without having to think about it too much. For instance, this bird in flight with such a bright, I think it's a sky, but it actually may be the light coming off the sea. This is a seabird, and I'll instinctively just roll the exposure compensation dial higher so I can render this scene nice and bright. And again, if you're unsure, just keep an eye on the histogram in the viewfinder. You can use the histograms like you would a rear vision mirror in a car. You're just taking a small amount of notice of it as you're working. Okay, and in a scene like this, there's a very dark shadow behind this raptor that is displaying its wings here. Now, this will influence the meter to start raising the exposure, because that dark shadow is very, very dark, and so it's wanting to factor that into the overall exposure. So you might find yourself using a negative exposure to compensate for that, so that we don't overexpose some of those brightest highlights, such as the highlights on the beak there. Now again, you might roll the exposure compensation dial a little bit too much, but then you can fine tune it in post-processing. Again, with this face tone here, the face switched on in the multimeter will help in this instance. But again, the dominance of such dark tones surrounding this model might lead to a little bit of overexposure, and you definitely don't want to overexpose the skin tones here. So if you do review one test shot, you want to make sure that those skin tones are not blinking at you. So let's go back into the FN menu and look for those metering mode again. We do have a couple of alternatives to multi and using exposure compensation that I want to discuss. It might make your work as a photographer a little bit faster or a little bit easier. Now I've highlighted here two alternatives to multi, and to be honest, they're a little bit out of dated. They sort of date back to an era where multi had not yet been invented. They are center weighted and taking an average of the entire screen. They will lead to more overexposed and underexposed images if we're not using or monitoring the histogram. The multi is a lot cleverer at getting exposures appropriately exposed and using less exposure compensation. So just makes your life a little bit easier than these alternatives. Some photographers might find a use for these, but I typically, well, I'll have to say I never use these two metering modes. There is, however, an alternative which, or a couple of alternatives, which I do find useful, so I'll spend a little bit of time covering those. One is the spot metering. Now you have two options here. You have standard and large. The standard will be the default. So if I just start, if I hit the enter button and start using this, it'll start metering off just that area within that circle. Now it does require that you position that circle very accurately. You will notice that on the back of the full frame cameras we have an automatic exposure lock. So you can point the camera, that center circle, at something with an appropriate tone, and we're looking for a mid-tone, okay, not a highlight or a skin tone, unless it's a very dark skin tone. We're looking to position that over a mid-tone. And some photographers who have been persuaded to use this, being told it's more accurate. Well, it is accurate, but only if it's pointed at an appropriate tone. Okay, so and the other option is to use a large spot, and you see that is much larger. So that will take an average within a much larger area in the center of the frame. So if you have a lot of very bright or very dark tones around the edges, this might give you a better average exposure using this large spot. Okay, small spots can be very tricky to use, so if you were going to use spot, I probably would steer you towards using the large version before coming down and using that small. Okay, let's go back into the function menu. Okay, there is a way of using this spot a lot more accurately without pointing the center portion of the camera at the tone you want to expose for and then recomposing the shot, because not always the most appropriate tone will be in the center of the frame. So let's come over to focus area. Now you might have it set to wide, but what I'd like you to try if you're using the spot metering functions is to come down to the flexible spot. Now we have three sizes in here. We have small, medium and large. So I'll show you what will happen if I select the small focus area. Okay, so that small focus area will now appear inside of the spot metering system. So if we choose to use this setup, we will focus on the area that we're also taking a meter reading from. Now this may be appropriate, it may be inappropriate, but I just wanted to show you what the graphic looks like in the viewfinder or on the monitor when you're choosing this workflow. If I go and choose a medium sized AF area, then again you'll see that the focus area now just comes outside of the spot metering area. Now when choosing an AF area, I would always lean people towards using a slightly larger AF area, because really when using a spot AF, you're looking to find an edge with reasonable contrast. These Sony Alpha cameras prefer vertical edges rather than horizontal edges for some reason. If we go over to the large flexible spot, then again you'll see that AF area now extends beyond the metering area. So those are the three icons that you'll get used to seeing if you want to use spot. Okay, so let's move over to the metering mode and choose a large metering. Again, this will change the icon that we're seeing there. So now we've got that large metering area and we've got a large focus area inside of that metering area. Now, there is an option in the menus that will give us a little bit more flexibility, because at the moment, if we move, say, the multi-selector, some people refer to it as the joystick left or right, we're focusing on an area outside of the area that we're metering for the most appropriate tone. Now, if we go into the menu systems, here I'm in the first camera menu. I'm on page 10 on this particular camera. You might find that it moves page on your model of camera, but what you're looking for is the spot metering point menu. Now, this may not appear on the second generation of alpha cameras. It's here on the third generation, the A7 III, the A7R3, the A9, and probably every subsequent alpha that is now released. We have an option here, which by default it will be set to center, but you can move it to focus point link. Now, this is an incredibly useful feature if you're going to use spot metering, because now if I do move the AF point, the metering point will follow the focus point. Okay, so already you're probably seeing that this is going to be a lot more useful, because as soon as I move the focus point to the left, it'll start metering from that area as well. So you may want to go into the menus and activate this option if you're going to be using spot metering. Okay, so let's go back to spot standard here on the metering mode. And we've got that larger focus area. So again, moving left and right will follow that over. Just showing you how the icons change so you're comfortable that one is for metering, one is for focus, and now they're linked. Okay, so in this a very interesting image here, okay, I've just positioned one of the black alpha lens caps. It's a black tone that I had lying around when I wanted to do this demo, and the interesting piece of cardboard on the right is a very specific tone of grey. It's often referred to as a photographer's grey card. It's been manufactured to have 18% reflectance, and this is typically what metering systems inside cameras are trying to do. It is trying to create an average of all of the tones in the scene and represent it as 18% grey. Okay, so if you were to put a metering spot metering point on an 18% grey card, you are going to get the most appropriate exposure. The only problem is when we walk around in the broader world, there's a vast shortage of 18% grey cards hanging around for us to put our spot meter on. Okay, so that is one of the difficulties of using a small spot meter. If I was to roll that, and it's now following with my joystick or multi-selector, if I position that over the white, the black tones will be underexposed. If we look at the histogram, you'll see the histogram start climbing up the left side, showing underexposure. And we also have a large gap on the right hand side, saying those white tones are not being presented as white anymore. In fact, they're being presented as grey, mid-grey, because that's where we put the spot metering point. If I move the spot metering point over to the lens clap, which is black, then you'll see that we render that grey, and now the white paper that the grey card is sitting on is being overexposed. Okay, and again that is indicated by the histogram with the tall peak climbing up the right side of that window, indicating overexposure. So you can see if we were to use spot metering on a day-to-day basis, we'd end up with massive amounts of underexposed and overexposed images, depending on where we position that spot. For instance, I showed that raptor before. If I was to position it over the dark shadow background, it is going to present that as a mid-tone grey, and all of the highlights on the eagle, on the beak of the eagle, are now going to be overexposed. If I move the spot metering point over to the bird's plumage, we're going to get a more appropriate exposure. Now, if the feathers of the bird are mid-tone, then we're going to get a very accurate exposure. But if we were positioning over the feathers of a white bird, we're going to get a grey bird. Okay, so again, it is dependent on the tone that you're putting that spot meter over. Again, in a portrait situation, this would be incredibly difficult to do with moving subjects. You'd have to be very quick and accurate. Here we're overexposing, and I've got a little movie just to show you panning left and right, just showing you how quickly the metering moves there between overexposure and underexposure. And as it's moving to the very bright skin tone of this young woman, it's actually underexposing that skin, because this should be 1 EV or 1 f-stop higher than maybe a mid-tone. Okay, so again, here's a graphic showing you if we were to put a spot metering point on a skin tone, if it's a fair skinned person, you're not going to get that fair skin. So you're going to have to use the exposure compensation dial with that spot metering. So some people may have told you spot metering is the most accurate, and as you can see from these demonstrations, it can be accurate, but it does take a little bit of work. So in this instance, I would actually just find it quicker to use a multi-metering mode and use the exposure compensation dial. And if I'm reviewing the image, I would just check that the white glove or the skin tones are not overexposed when choosing this. Okay, so what I've got here now is a black piece of velvet with a little tile, one of those electronic tiles to help you find things you've lost, sitting on top of that. Now, if we're using a multi-metering system, again, it's going to be fooled by all of that black and thinking, well, that's a bit too dark, I'm going to brighten the exposure to a mid-tone. This will lead the highlight in this instance to be overexposed, and again you can see that on the histogram climbing up the right wall of that histogram saying I'm overexposed. Okay, so again you could use your exposure compensation dial. You might need to come down -2 stops or EV to get an appropriate exposure, or there is a new metering mode on the latest model alpha cameras which makes this very easy. Okay, so, and it's called highlight, and it's there to protect the brightest highlights in your image, and it will push the other tones, the mid-tones and shadows, further down. But in some instances, maybe at a concert where we've got a large sea of unexposed or unlit scene, we don't need to get a good exposure in those dark areas. It's okay to let them tip to very near or absolute black, so long as we don't overexpose maybe the artist on the stage who's being lit by the spotlight. And so highlight metering mode can be very useful in these instances. There is no spot to move around the scene. The camera will find the highlight and expose accurately. The instances where this may not work is if you've actually got a light source, maybe a stage light pointing towards the camera. The camera will see that as the brightest highlight and try and make an appropriate exposure of that light. And so there are some instances where this may lead you astray, but in many instances this can be a very fast metering system which is very accurate. Alternative to that would be a spot, but remember, putting a spot metering point onto something that is white will lead it to be exposed as grey. So this would lead to underexposure. So you can see how highlight in this instance will leave it as a highlight but not try to expose it as a midtone. So a couple of examples where highlight might absolutely be the best exposure metering mode to use would be in this instance, where again we've got a dark night scene around this young woman being lit by her mobile phone, and highlight would just ensure that the white on her top there doesn't overexpose, because that's the brightest point, well as well as the thumb actually on the mobile phone itself. So highlight will protect these brightest tones for you. And then you're always at liberty to make a fine adjustment in post-processing if it's been a little bit of aggressive in maybe protecting the highlights a little bit too much. Another example, I didn't actually use this in this instance, but you could see where highlight would work with this subject matter. It will protect the brightest feathers on this white plumage here. And in this instance, the sky may be a problem, but in this instance we've got a very deep blue sky, and so it's going to base the exposure not on the sky, which is the brightest highlight, but on the sunlit feathers, the white feathers on this bird in flight. So again, in this instance, highlight would be your savior, rather than trying to work out whether you need to be on manual exposure or a multi with a 1 or 2 stop raised exposure value, and then risk clipping the feathers on the wing. Highlight would do all of that thinking for you and give you an exposure with no overexposed feathers. In many instances, there is no right metering mode, of course, there is just choice. In this instance, highlight would have made a good job and ensured that the headphones around the neck of this young man were not overexposed. But if you're used to using multi and using that exposure compensation dial, and you have the face priority in the metering mode switched on, you might find that you just instinctively just do a minor compensation, maybe -1 in this instance, just to allow for the very dark background surrounding this young man. Okay, now there is a workflow that is nothing to do with metering modes, the automated metering systems in the camera, which many photographers implement because of their understanding of exposure. And in this instance, this image was shot in manual exposure mode. So all of the metering systems are basically disabled. Well, in saying that, you will still get at the bottom of the EVF and the monitor, you'll still see whether the camera thinks you're overexposing or underexposing. But in this instance, I used manual exposure. Now, there is an exposure, a rule of thumb. It's often referred to as a rule of photography, and it's called the Sony 16 rule. And this rule states that if it's sunny, then if you set the camera to f16 and you match the ISO and the shutter speed, your exposure would be correct. And the example I've given here is f16, 100 ISO, 100th of a second. Now this would absolutely ensure that this white dress being caught in the sunlight will not overexpose. And many street photographers working on sunlit streets actually find it much easier just to use the Sony 16 rule. Now you can adapt the Sony 16 rule to your own workflow. For instance, if you want to not have any subject blur behind pedestrians moving quickly in the street, then you can simply maybe shoot at f16 but raise the shutter speed to 400th of a second and the ISO to 400. So long as you match the ISO and the shutter speed, then you'll still carry on getting appropriate exposures. Now if you don't need to shoot everything at f16 because you don't want maybe the ISO going too high, then again you could maybe open up 2 f-stops. It's to f8 from f16, and then you can reduce the amount of light because you must compensate for that using either the ISO or shutter speed. You could then set the shutter speed to 1/400th of a second, which is 2 EV, So you've increased 2 EV on the aperture and you've decreased 2 EV on the shutter speed. So now you can be shooting this scene at f8 with 1/400th of a second to freeze to pedestrians, so there's no subject blur, but using the base level 100 ISO in your camera. So my own tutor at my own college didn't use metering systems. He just learned to gauge the ambient light and set the camera for these instances. Okay, because so long as you're capturing without the light source changing, then pretty much all exposures are a constant. The metering systems are working on reflected light and they don't know what the subjects are, so they are often challenged in this instance rather than taking an ambient light meter reading rather than the reflected light meter reading. Okay, but handheld light meters are not so popular these days, but certainly you could invest a little bit of time researching the Sony 16 rule a little bit more, so you don't actually have to worry about exposure at all. Okay, so just to remember, you're always trying to expose for the highlights. Ever since I've been doing photography, overexposed highlights is always the reason we throw images in the bin. So long as you can process the files and bring up the shadows, then you've got an image that is usable. Okay, so hopefully you've learnt a few things in metering modes. Thumbs up if you have, or you just want to show your appreciation. Remember to go over to my website, markgaylor.com. Everything on my website is free. I have downloads, whether it's Photoshop Actions, Lightroom presets, ebooks, and links to all manner of learning, and also my blog, which is very active. Okay, I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Global Imaging Ambassador.